We all learn at a young age the perils of being perceived as different. We learn that others have the power to single out, to ridicule, to turn away from, and to mark the one who is different. Choose your own memories, but one way or another we've all felt the pain of the little boy who wanted to write poems, or the little girl who tried to join the Sandlot ball game. As an artist, you learn these lessons all over again and with a vengeance. In following the path of your heart, the chances are that your work will not be understandable to others, at least not immediately, and not to a wide audience. That was a quote from Art and Fear, a book published in 1993. And while I don't think that authors David Bales and Ted Orland had the idea of how minorities' artwork is perceived in mind while writing it, this does relate to the topic that we'll be discussing today, that being the practice of art critique, or crit, the current state of art critique, and examining what art critique could be. I'm sure everybody has participated in crit before, and I'm also sure everybody has gotten or witnessed a bad critique at least once, and have felt the pain of not being understood by others, of being misinterpreted, or feeling unacknowledged, like you weren't being listened to. This feeling of being unacknowledged or misunderstood, well, it's sure to affect everyone at some point or another, is compounded for minority students. The purpose of this talk, we're going to focus on the experiences of students of color at the university level. Our delve into this world of critique begins with the concept of the room of silence. This phrase comes from a 2016 documentary which explored the experiences of minority students at RISD in studio art classes. So let's take a look at what they had to say.
The room of silence is when you make artwork tends to be around the trope of race, identity, sexuality, etc. And everyone in the room is silent and has nothing to say about your work, be it because they don't know how to talk about it or they don't want to talk about it.
The crit is often offensive or doesn't address the obvious emotional aspects of a piece or personal aspects.
It's just a very unfair thing, because then the attitude is like, okay, moving on, brush this one under the rug, and then we don't have to talk about that ever again.
Students described this room of silence effect as an experience of either not receiving critique at all, or receiving critique that felt superficial or didn't acknowledge the deeper meanings behind the piece they were presenting. Students felt isolated and gaslit into thinking the issues they faced as minorities weren't a big deal because they weren't being treated as being worth talking about. And while they felt the pressure to be educators for their classroom, for students who only seemed to have knowledge of Western art history, they also felt like they weren't being listened to. At the same time, they worried if they pushed the issue of discussing the meaning behind their piece, they would come off as angry or aggressive, and overall it led to this sense of feeling othered and alone in a classroom, especially in settings where white students are the vast majority. These personal experiences of students of color were also explored in a 2021 study, The Experiences of Black Art Students in Critique, which brings attention to one of the fundamental reasons why modern critiques are so ineffective. The way that art is taught in America centers mostly around the Western world. It teaches European art standards as default and ensures that Eurocentric ideals of art are the ones that are placed front and center. And this kind of creates the idea that any issues to deal with race or any expressions of art from non-Western cultures are off limits or taboo subjects. The lack of exposure to art that deals with other races and racisms perpetuates this issue by creating white students who are unsure and afraid of how to talk about race, and thus simply decide not to. This cultural incompetence and learned helplessness harms students of color in a myriad of ways. Students feel both hypervisible and invisible, subjectable to harsh criticism for daring to bring up race in their work, as well as dismissal and a complete lack of effective critique and dialogue. At the same time, the student is expected to be an educator on aspects of their culture which by all means would be common knowledge if white students just had a bit more cultural exposure like they did with Western cultures. All of this can lead to a high level of stress for students of color in an already stressful art school environment. All this goes to say, if our current method of teaching and critiquing art is only working for some students, those being the white students, then it really isn't working at all. This method doesn't generate useful or productive conversation about art. What it's doing is upholding Eurocentric standards and shutting down important conversations that need to be had by encouraging students of color to censor themselves and make themselves more palatable to the white-dominated art world. Therefore, it's absolutely necessary to shift the way that we talk and think about art. So now that we've identified some of the issues at hand, we can start thinking about ways to tackle them. In my process of researching critique, I felt an urge to revisit the activity that we did as a class at the beginning of the year, in which we generated our teaching philosophy. For me, I stated I wanted my students to feel safe asking questions, making mistakes, and asking for help. I also wanted them to feel respected, understood, and listened to by peers and staff alike. And it surprised me just how relevant this philosophy was to a topic I hadn't even considered researching yet. So in order to generate healthy critique, that's exactly the type of environment you'd hope to achieve. If you're teaching art in a K-12 setting, the way that you approach art critique is obviously going to vary significantly based both on age and the general needs of your students in class. And while the methods that I'm suggesting are more tailored towards the age group that I'm interested in working with, which are high schoolers, I think if you do it effectively, you can introduce the idea of critique to any age group. So how exactly can we create that healthy environment to have these conversations? First, open up a dialogue in your classroom by involving students in how critique gets done. This is something that Judith Lehman discussed in Pragmatics of Studio Critique. Rather than just have students jump in and figure out how to critique on the spot, you can come up with ideas with your students. Her approach was sort of a two-prong approach that she developed with her class, where they first generated base observations on a given piece based on purely the visuals, and then moved into making connections between them to generate meaning. This process of taking in the work in its entirety is a really good baseline for critique, but the actual method that you use in the class is going to take trial and error, most likely, and it's okay if the first one you try isn't necessarily the right method. Second, generate conversation about minority artists and their work. You can use artists of color as exemplars for various projects, and talk about how their ideas about and experiences with their racial background affects their work. You can use exemplars as a way to practice critiquing artwork, to generate conversations about race and get students comfortable with critique before implementing it with your students themselves. Some well-known contemporary Black artists that you could use for this are Gandhi Wiley and Titus Kaphar. Third, maintain awareness of contemporary issues, current events, and the backgrounds and cultures of your students. Don't put the pressure on your students of color to act as educators for the class. Let them decide how much they'd like to share, and find ways to use your knowledge of students' backgrounds and the cultures of people like them to help generate the dialogue in class. Number 4, be willing to acknowledge your shortcomings and to apologize for and amend your mistakes. No teacher is ever going to be perfect, and putting the pressure on yourself is part of what causes dialogue about race to remain unspoken. Remember that you serve as a role model for your students. How you behave during critiques and at all times regarding minorities will send signals to your students about the proper way to address race in art, and also how you respond to your students calling you on any mistakes you make will also say a lot to them. Number 5, be willing to steer critique in the right direction. During crit, anybody who speaks has the power to shift the conversation in infinite ways. So give students an opportunity to give an artist statement or ask what they'd like to get feedback on when presenting their work. And if you notice the conversation moving around or past the desired topic, not through it, be willing to get the group back on the right track and discuss what is actually relevant. These suggestions that I'm making here are just the beginning to unpacking this wider issue. Racism in art critique is part of a much larger institutional problem, but that doesn't mean we're powerless to do anything about it. So change will start small, and in this case, change is going to start in the classroom. The students of today are the educators of tomorrow, so let's work towards breaking this cycle.